August 19th, 2025. In a world distracted by headlines from Washington, Brussels, and Beijing, a thunderclap erupted from a place many in the West seldom notice: Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. On that day, Captain Ibrahim, the 37-year-old leader of this West African nation, issued a command that stunned the globe: the expulsion of the United Nations' highest representative from his soil. This was not just a diplomatic skirmish. It was a declaration that shook the very foundations of international order, accused the UN of espionage, political interference, and economic sabotage, and then, in front of the cameras of the world, he gave them just 72 hours to leave. For decades, Africa has been portrayed as a continent bound by dependency, its leaders silenced by powerful capitals overseas. But here was a young president daring to turn the script upside down. Was this the first spark of a continental uprising, or was it the reckless gamble of a man defying the most powerful nations on earth? If you believe that Africa's awakening has begun, stay with me through this story. And if you are one of the few who still value truth over headlines, subscribe now, because what you are about to hear is not just Africa's news. It is history in the making. Las 9 alto M. Ogu. The morning sun burned over the dusty streets as Barbama, the United Nations resident coordinator, walked into what she believed would be another routine meeting on humanitarian aid. A diplomat seasoned in war zones from Asia to the Middle East, she carried the quiet confidence of someone used to working behind the veil of international bureaucracy. She had no idea she was about to become part of history. At 10:30 a.m., the illusion shattered. Summoned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, she entered a chamber where cameras were already rolling. Across the table sat Karamoko Jean-Marie, the foreign minister, no relation to the president, flanked by stern-faced officers. The room carried a tension so sharp it felt carved into the air itself. The minister stood, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and began to read aloud. His voice did not waver. By order of the President of Burkina Faso, you are hereby declared persona non grata. You have 72 hours to leave the territory. Your accreditation is permanently revoked. Silence. For a moment, the weight of those words seemed to freeze the room. Manzi's expression faltered. This was no expulsion from a minor office. This was the ejection of the United Nations itself, the very institution presented to the world as guardian of peace. And then came the accusation: interference in domestic affairs, espionage disguised as aid, mapping of mineral resources for Western companies, secret meetings with opposition figures. The charges thundered like cannon fire, leaving no space for negotiation. That afternoon, Captain Ibrahim himself faced the press. Cameras flashed as he declared, "The era of neo-colonial manipulation through international organizations is over." Behind him, the flag draped in solemn defiance. His words were not just for Burkina Faso. They were for a continent, and perhaps even for a world that had long underestimated Africa's resolve. What followed would ripple across every Western capital. Some called it madness, others called it liberation, but all agreed on one fact. On that morning, the United Nations was told to pack its bags and leave a sovereign African land. For a few hours, the world assumed this was just a symbolic gesture, headline designed to rattle nerves before politics returned to normal. But Ibrahim was not finished. By the next morning, the story had evolved into something far more dangerous for the global establishment. At 2 p.m. on August 19th, he stepped before the press once more. This time, he did not come with rhetoric. He came with evidence. Screens flickered to life in the packed briefing hall. Audio recordings of phone conversations between UN staff and Western embassy officials played aloud, their voices unmistakable. In those hushed tones, diplomats discussed troop positions, mineral maps, and regime stability. Then came the emails, project files exchanged between UN agencies and foreign governments, charting the geology of Burkina Faso's gold and uranium reserves. Bank transfers followed, tracing suspicious funds from UN accounts into the hands of political operatives tied to opposition movements. The room gasped. It was no longer S-word against the West. It was documentation, hard, undeniable, devastating. Western media scrambled to frame the revelations as propaganda, but even longtime critics have found themselves shaken. Dr. Amina, a political scientist known for opposing military rule, admitted on Al Jazeera, "I do not support authoritarianism, but if these documents are authentic, they expose interference of the highest order. It is deeply disturbing." And then, Africa's most revered voice broke his silence. On August 21st, at the Pan-African Leadership Conference in Nairobi, Professor Pilo Lumumba stepped onto the stage. His words ignited like fire across the continent. "For too long, we have pretended that international organizations are neutral. The evidence from Burkina Faso proves what many of us have always known: they are instruments of control. Captain Ibrahim has done what Mandela could not, what Nkrumah could not, what even Sankara could not. He has cut the tentacles of neo-colonialism with his own hands." The hall erupted. Across Africa, young people replayed his speech in classrooms, markets, and public squares. Hashtags thundered through social media: Jean and Jean. Africa for Africans. Within 24 hours, solidarity rallies erupted in Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg. Students waved banners that read, "Africa is not for sale." For the first time in generations, Africans were not merely watching history unfold, they were participants, builders, soldiers in a movement that spanned borders without needing a single central command. Meanwhile, in the corridors of Washington, Paris, and London, panic set in. A simple expulsion had morphed into a continental awakening. What was supposed to be a footnote in global politics was now a headline that would not disappear. By September, what began as a diplomatic clash in Ouagadougou had transformed into a worldwide reckoning. The United Nations, humiliated by its expulsion, attempted damage control, insisting that the allegations were fabrications. Yet every denial only fueled further suspicion. The documents leaked. Biased governments circulated on independent African media, translated into French, Arabic, English, and Swahili. The world was reading them line by damning line. And then, the unthinkable happened. On October 12th, the Norwegian Nobel Committee announced its shortlist for the Peace Prize. To the shock of many, Ibrahim's name stood among it. For decades, the Nobel had favored dissidents, backed by Western interests. Now, for the first time in modern memory, the committee entertained the possibility of awarding it to a leader who had directly defied the West. The announcement detonated like a bomb. Western capitals raged. Diplomats accused Norway of legitimizing authoritarianism. Editorials in major newspapers denounced the very idea. Yet in the streets of Accra, Bamako, Kampala, and Dakar, the news was greeted with fireworks. Children carried posters with the words, "Our future, our freedom." At the Pan-African University in Nairobi, students held an all-night vigil, chanting, "From Sankara to the torch still burns." In Johannesburg, murals of his face appeared overnight on abandoned buildings. In Lagos, musicians released songs hailing him as the Lion of Burkina. The Nobel nomination had given symbolic armor to a movement already in motion, but the story was not confined to Africa. Across Latin America, echoes of Che Guevara were invoked in solidarity. In Venezuela, President Maduro called a brother in the struggle against empire. In Bolivia, Evo Morales praised him as the Sankara of our century. Even in Europe, youth movements began questioning the integrity of international organizations once assumed sacred. Washington, Paris, and Brussels responded with fury. Aid packages were frozen. Sanctions were threatened. Anonymous officials leaked whispers of military options. Yet these threats, once so intimidating, now seemed hollow. Every attempt to isolate Burkina Faso only made it a rallying point. Then came the defining moment. On November 3rd, Captain addressed the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, standing at the same podium where countless leaders had once begged for aid. He declared in a voice that shook the hall, "We are not beggars. We are not children. We are the heirs of empires older than Europe itself. If they deny us aid, we will feed ourselves. If they deny us trade, we will trade among ourselves. And if they deny us peace, then we shall make peace by our own hands. Burkina Faso will never again kneel before any power, be it the United Nations or any empire disguised as one. The summits erupted in thunderous applause. For the first time in decades, the African Union appeared united not as a collection of fragile states, but as a body infused with fire. Leaders from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad pledged their support. A new bloc, informally dubbed the Sahel Front, announced joint projects in energy, defense, and agriculture, free from Western oversight. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. What began with the expulsion of a UN official had grown into a continental project, a rebirth of Pan-Africanism. The Nobel nomination elevated it from rebellion to legitimacy. Meanwhile, ordinary Africans felt the tremors in their daily lives. In Bamako, market women raised their fists in defiance, saying, "This is for our children." In Dakar, taxi drivers plastered S picture on their windshields. In Kampala, students debated his speeches late into the night, daring to imagine a future without dependency. By December, commentators across the world began using a single phrase, "the moment," a term that captured both the fragility and power of what was unfolding. It was about an awakening long overdue. History rarely gives Africa such moments, but when it does, the world remembers. History is never written in the calm of the moment, it is forged in storms. The expulsion of the United Nations from Burkina Faso, followed by the avalanche of evidence and the Nobel nomination, became one of those storms. What began as a defiant gesture had transformed into a continental earthquake, and the aftershocks reshaped Africa's place in the 21st century. By early 2026, the diplomatic consequences were undeniable. Several African states, Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad, formally announced a suspension of UN political missions on their soil, citing breach of trust. Others, such as Tanzania and Ethiopia, demanded sweeping reforms before allowing continued operations. The once unshakable image of the United Nations as neutral arbiter now stood tarnished. Western governments, stunned by the rapid unraveling of their influence, scrambled to contain the fallout. Sanctions on Burkina Faso backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating the country, they accelerated the creation of alternative trade corridors. Gold shipments once bound for Switzerland began flowing to Dubai, Shanghai, and Ankara. Russia and China swiftly filled the vacuum, offering military aid and infrastructure investment with no political strings attached. It was clear. The monopoly was broken. Africa had options now. Perhaps the most profound consequence lay not in diplomacy, but in economics. Inspired by Burkina Faso's defiance, a consortium of Sahel nations launched the Gold for Growth initiative. Under this pact, member states agreed to sell a portion of their mineral wealth only to African buyers or through African exchanges. The move was radical. For decades, African gold and uranium had flowed cheaply to Western markets, while the continent remained impoverished. Within 2 years, the new system redirected billions of dollars into African coffers. Local industries began to sprout: refineries, manufacturing plants, and regional banks. For the first time, African leaders could point to a model that turned natural wealth into national development. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a fragile, landlocked state, became the unlikely laboratory of economic independence. Yet perhaps the deepest transformation was psychological. For generations, Africans had been told they could not stand without Western aid. That independence was symbolic, but not practical. The sight of a young captain standing against the United Nations and surviving shattered that illusion. In schools across the continent, new curricula began to include chapters on the moment. University debates flourished around Pan-African unity, sovereignty, and the limits of globalization. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers embraced as a symbol. Songs hailed him as the son of Sankara. Murals painted his likeness next to Nkrumah, Lumumba, and Mandela. A renaissance of African pride surged, rooted not in nostalgia but in defiance of the present. For many young Africans, the message was simple. If Burkina Faso could defy the world and win, then so could they. The impact did not stop at Africa's shores. In Latin America, leaders invoked the Burkinabe moment as proof that small nations could resist imperial pressure. Movements in Asia and the Middle East, studied as tactics as a template for asserting sovereignty. Even in Europe, youth organizations critical of NATO and global finance began citing Burkina Faso as a case study in grassroots resistance. Meanwhile, the Nobel Committee found itself trapped in a storm of its own making. Awarding the Peace Prize risked an open break with the West, but ignoring him risked delegitimizing the prize itself. Either way, the mere nomination had already shifted the conversation. It proved that the world could no longer dismiss Africa's struggles as background noise. But with glory came danger. Western intelligence agencies did not sit idle. Assassination rumors swirled. Anonymous leaks hinted at coup plots. French media speculated openly about neutralizing before his influence spread further. His survival became a matter of continental Predevary rallying cry. Every mural, every hashtag carried an unspoken vow. If they kill him, they kill us all. This tension only added to the mythology. The captain was no longer just a leader. He was a living symbol of resistance. His very survival proof that Africa could not be silenced. Years from now, historians may debate the flaws and contradictions of S-rule. They may point to mistakes in governance, excesses of nationalism, or the risks of aligning too closely with rival powers. But none of that will erase the shockwave of his defiance. For in the end, history is not always shaped by the most powerful nations, but by those who dare to disrupt them. And on that fateful morning when the United Nations was told to leave Burkina Faso, the world glimpsed a future where Africa was no longer a passive stage, but an active actor in global affairs. That moment raw, defiant, unapologetic echoes. Still, Burkina Faso, a country once dismissed as powerless, had cracked the foundations of a world order centuries in the making. Whether that order collapses or adapts, one truth cannot be denied. The balance of power will never again be the same. And in the streets of Ouagadougou, where children chant his name, the future feels closer than ever. Just when the world thought the storm had peaked, a new revelation surfaced. Declassified intelligence reports first leaked by whistleblowers within the African Union revealed that the expulsion of the United Nations was not merely a reaction to interference. It was part of a carefully calculated strategy months in the making. According to the documents, Ibrahim had quietly formed a Pan-African security compact, an intelligence-sharing network, linking Burkina Faso with Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even sympathetic officers in countries still under Western sway. This hidden alliance was designed to counter espionage, disrupt foreign-backed coup attempts, and most shockingly expose financial pipelines used by multinationals to siphon Africa's wealth. What stunned observers most was the revelation that had anticipated retaliation. The countdown of 72 hours was not just bravado. It was a trap. By forcing the UN to withdraw under pressure, he triggered a wave of continental solidarity, ensuring that any Western attempt to strike back would be seen not as diplomacy, but as imperial aggression. The twist was clear. The young captain had not stumbled into defiance. He had orchestrated a mass. Burkina Faso was not just resisting, it was leading, and the world was beginning to realize that the center of gravity was shifting. The consequences of this revelation were immediate. In European capitals, policymakers scrambled to understand how a landlocked nation of barely 20 million had managed to outmaneuver the most entrenched institutions on Earth. In Washington, congressional hearings demanded explanations from intelligence chiefs. How had Ibrahim, dismissed as a mere soldier without pedigree, outplayed the global establishment? The answer was unsettling. Because he embodied something the old powers could not counter, a cause larger than himself. For Africans, was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He had become the living embodiment of sovereignty, the proof that dignity could not be negotiated, only definite. The twist was not only political, it was spiritual. Sermons in African churches, khutbahs in mosques, and songs in marketplaces all carried his name. The people began to see him not just as a leader, but as a vessel of a rising consciousness. In that moment, the balance of power shifted, not because Burkina Faso had tanks or missiles, but because it held something stronger: the ability to inspire. The empire of fear was cracking, and in its place rose the empire of hope. The world finally understood. This was not a story. It was the opening chapter of Africa's new epic. In the heart of West Africa, where deserts meet savanna. A new story has been written not of despair, but of defiance. Ibrahim stood before the world and declared that Burkina Faso would no longer bow, and in doing so, he gave voice to millions who had long been silenced. This was not merely the removal of the United Nations. It was the reclamation of dignity. It was the proof that a nation, no matter how small, could stand tall if its people believed in themselves. And it was the reminder that freedom is never granted, it is seized. Today, the world watches Burkina Faso with awe and unease. Some fear the collapse of the old order. Others see the birth of a new one. But one truth echoes from Ouagadougou to every corner of Africa. The spirit of resistance lives again, as President Ibrahim himself declared. We do not ask permission to be free. We rise and we claim it. If you believe that this awakening matters, share this story. Subscribe to Stand with the Voices of Africa, for history is being written and you are witnessing it unfold.